Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a Willoughby book talk online conversation with Samuel Bagg, who is the author of this very timely book titled The Dispersion of Power, a Critical Realist Theory of Democracy. And joining him in conversation is James Boyce. Samuel Bagg is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches political theory. He has also taught at the University of Oxford, McGill University, and Duke University, where he received his PhD. His research in democratic theory has appeared in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Political Philosophy, and many, many other venues. And I am so pleased and so grateful that he's made the time to do this for us. James Boyce, author, naturalist, economist, and senior fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he is also Professor Emeritus of Economics. He received his BA at Yale University and his doctorate from Oxford University. He has had a very long and significant career, but let me just read a couple of things here. He led the Adjustment Towards Peace project for the United Nations Development Program in post-war El Salvador, and was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship for research and writing on the economics of peace building. He has also written for a series of publications, including Harper's, the New York Times, Scientific American, Politico, the Los Angeles Times, and numerous scholarly journals. He is the author of several books. Including a 7-part video series, which he created. It's called The Economics of War and Peace, which provides a powerful, insightful analysis of a topic that traditionally has been a taboo or labeled non-economic by the economics profession, and I would highly recommend that. So here we are. We have James K. Boyce here and Samuel Ely Bagg, and we're going to be talking about democracy. And why Sam thinks that we need to get it right. We all have this niggling feeling that it's not working. We turn up for election after election as good citizens and we vote. But things don't quite work out. We feel powerless, and we want to know why and how we can change this. So Sam, if you could please begin by introducing yourself and your argument for lay people to understand what you're saying and why you're saying it, so that we can carry on from there.
Great, thank you so much, and I'm really pleased to be able to present in this context and this venue. So thank you to Rabia for inviting me, and to Jim for being willing to engage and have a conversation about this, and to all of you for being here. So the main idea of the book, I'll just start by saying is that the ways that we usually think about democracy, right? What it is, why it matters, how to make it better. Those habits of thought are actually getting in our way, making it harder for us to defend and enrich democracy. And so I propose a different way of thinking about it, which I think can offer better guidance. And there's a lot going on in the book, obviously. I'm going to try to pull out 3 things that I can talk about in this, in just to start us off, right? First, the American government is captured in many consequential ways by oligarchic elites. Second, the proposals that you typically hear about as solutions are not going to cut it, and I think that's because they're committed to an implausible vision of what democracy is. And third, if we have a more plausible vision of of what democracy is, I think the most important thing we have to do is build organized forms of collective countervailing power among ordinary people. So to say a bit more about what I mean by those things. The first thing you probably think of when you hear this idea of capture or oligarchic capture is the idea of money in politics, right? So in other words, campaign donations, super PACs, Citizens United, all that good stuff. These are the most visible mechanisms of capture. They're also, I think, the least important mechanisms, right? The real action is elsewhere, right? The main reason that state policy serves oligarchic interests so reliably is not because they're able to sway elections or buy off candidates. You know, they can maybe do that in some cases. But what's more important than this most visible money in politics, the way I see it, is the influence of wealth behind the scenes, the money behind politics, if you will. So think about it this way. The visible part of the policymaking process is when parties campaign, get elected, make laws in Congress. And that's where the stereotypical money in politics comes in. But the thing is, that's only a small part of the story, actually. And in fact, this most visible realm, despite all the real problems with money in politics, this is actually the realm where things are most equal, relatively speaking. At least everybody actually has an equal vote in elections for now. At least you can see what's going on, right? And the thing is, that's not true of the agenda setting phase, often called the agenda setting phase in political science. But you can think of it as just the money behind politics before this sort of visible spectrum part, right? And a great deal of the oligarch's power lies here, where the most basic terms of political life are set, in the fact that issues which would really threaten their interests and their power never make it onto the agenda in the first place. So for instance, why do we tax income as a way to generate, revenue for the state rather than wealth for the most part? Wealth is far more unevenly distributed, and there's a lot more of it, right? So taxing it even a little bit could pay for quite a lot of stuff, but it's not even on the table. Then there's everything that happens after the visible part of the process, right? Suppose we manage to pass a law that challenges oligarchic power. Does the Supreme Court let it stand? How is it enforced? Bureaucrats often have social ties to wealthy elites. They get trained in the same law schools. They get job offers when they finish their stint in government. So they may not want to enforce the rules against oligarchs. And even if they wanted to, they might not have the resources to win in court against, dozens of high-paid lawyers. That's what happens in the tax system, for instance. We can call this the implementation phase, and capture is really important in this realm too, because it's these realms of money behind politics without visibility, without formal equality. That's where outcomes are even more powerfully driven by what I call organizational capacity. In other words, who has the incentive and the means to be able to find these hidden channels of influence and exploit them for all they're worth? This capacity is, of course, very unequally distributed. And there's tons of consequences of this that we could talk about. Perhaps the simplest way to summarize it is to see the result is in graphs like this, which you've probably seen, right? This one is from Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, showing that the top decile, the top 10% of income earners take nearly 50% of national income. You've probably seen things like this before. Here's another one showing wealth, the distribution of wealth rather than income, right? And remember, wealth is typically far more unequally distributed than income. In the past 50 years in this country, it's become much, much more unequal, right? Since 1983, median family income has barely budged. Median family wealth has barely budged, but the wealth of the top 1% has more than tripled, right? And that's not counting the wealth that's hidden in offshore accounts and so on. Okay, so that's where we are. A very quick summary. It won't be news to many of you. The question is of democracy is, what do we do about it? So here's one thing you've probably heard, right? The problem lies in the people who are supposed to be representing us. They're not representative. They're not responsive enough to the demands of ordinary people. And if that's right, what we need to do is fix the electoral process, the two-party system, or get money out of politics, or just let the people rule directly through referendums. And as you can probably tell, I'm not really convinced by this strategy. And here's why, right? It's not that I don't think these things could help. They could on the margins, but they're only tackling this visible spectrum, right? They're stuck fixing the problem of money in politics, not the real problems of money behind politics, right? They're not tackling the underlying inequalities of organizational capacity, the fact that wealthy elites have such vast advantages in fighting all these battles behind the scenes. And ultimately, I think the same problem applies to the other sort of most common paradigm for thinking about deepening democracy, which I call participatory inclusion. Basically, giving ordinary people more direct input into a wider range of decision-making processes through things like collaborative governance, participatory budgeting, deliberative mini-publics, citizens' assemblies. Maybe you've heard of some of these things, maybe you haven't. But they're very popular types of reform. When you think about democratic reform, people do this for a living, right? That's the primary thing that people are thinking of and talking about when they talk about democratic reforms. And it's a step in the right direction in some sense, right? Because it's starting to target some of these areas that are sort of behind politics. But again, there's two problems here. For one, it's still leaving most of these areas untouched, right? And for two, even if these participatory forums include more ordinary people in a somewhat wider range of decisions, those ordinary people are still unorganized, individualized, right? So they're still going to be majorly outflanked, outgunned by entrenched interests with resources and organizational capacity. To the extent that wealthy elites often end up liking these kinds of forums because they can still manage the outcomes, but now these outcomes have the sheen of democratic legitimacy. They feel democratic, even though they're not. I have two examples here on the slide that I can talk about if you're interested. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on and not talk about them in detail. But the point is really here in both cases and in all of this, in all of these cases that I could talk about, that participatory inclusion feels like democracy, but powerful elites can still often use it to get what they want. Because ultimately it's still focused on a different set of decision-making procedures, right? Elections are one sort of decision-making procedure. These other sort of additional participatory forms are additional decision-making procedures. And they're focusing on those rather than this underlying balance of forces in society. That, in my view, is really what's most essential to democracy. It's not about any particular procedure for determining the popular will if such a thing could exist. It's about ensuring a balance of power behind the scenes between different groups so that whatever negotiations are worked out in these inevitable behind the scenes deals are going to reflect a more equal distribution of power from the get-go, right? So what sorts of reforms or what sorts of practices and ideas and actions could address that underlying problem? Well, obviously, it's really hard, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do have a few things to say that I think can push us in the right direction, right? Ultimately, I think the goal needs to be policies that redistribute power on an ongoing basis, right? So redistribution of wealth and so on, as well as institutional reforms that actually block elite capture of institutions. So I can say more about that if you're interested. But the key thing is that you're not going to get either of those institutional political policy reforms, which are things that you have to change the law in order to do. You're not going to get any of those things unless you first redistribute power in society, on behind the scenes, in other ways. Before you ever get to change the law, right? And that requires building what I call countervailing power. That's the only way to sort of kickstart a process that is going to make power more equally balanced in society in this sort of behind-the-scenes sense that I've been talking about. So there's a lot of features of organized countervailing power that I could talk about, but I want to focus on just one, which I think is really important to understand, because there's a lot of things that go by the name of activism, right? Thing of a political action. We often reach for things. What do we do? The situation is so dire. How do we respond, right? And so we reach into these things that we call activism. But countervailing power, effective countervailing power, requires a very particular type of action. And so I think one of the most important things to think about in terms of saving or rescuing or helping democracy is is directing our energy in the right place. And the people who are best at countervailing power tend to distinguish it from ordinary forms of activism by most of what goes on in the name of activism, I would say. So, for instance, organizing is distinct from advocacy, in which small communities of highly committed activists persuade political leaders to adopt certain reforms through rational argument, right? It's not that we should never do that. It can get certain kinds of reforms passed, but its ability to achieve deeper changes that actually threaten elite interests, they're going to be severely limited because it does not make use of the power of numbers. So the first key feature of organizing is that it's based on mass collective action. This, in turn, means that organizers have to bring in people who are not already on their side, right? They have to get opponents of a union, for instance, to go on strike. They have to get disengaged people to become political. It can't be just about the usual suspects, right? The self-identified activists. Large numbers means ordinary people. Now, certain forms of what's called mobilization can do this too, right? The classic example is you whip up the rage machine, you get thousands, maybe even millions of people to show up at a protest in, pink hats or whatever it is. But organizing is distinct from mobilization too. And the reason is that mobilization uses the power of large numbers, but in a disorganized way that cannot be sustained over long periods of time, right? By contrast, organizing has to have a really long time horizon. It has to be sustainable for a long period. It can't be just a kind of one-off mobilization or a rally or a protest, where again, elites can just shrug it off, wait it out, especially now that they're used to a certain repertoire of protest, right? It's not going to surprise them anymore. It won't threaten their interests. Finally, organizers are relentlessly focused on the power structure and on the opportunities that are afforded within that power structure. Who are actually the power brokers? And more importantly, what kinds of power can ordinary people plausibly wield if they're organized effectively, which would enable them to force their demands on those power brokers, not persuade them, not convince them, force them to win demands, right? And this is maybe the trickiest part because there aren't actually that many kinds of power that ordinary people can wield like this. And I think the biggest problem with a lot of activism is that it doesn't take this limitation seriously, right? We get angry, we want to do something, but the hardest thing to accept is that sometimes there actually isn't anything that we can do yet about the thing that's getting us most angry, at least not in the short term, right? Because we don't have that kind of power yet, and it's not within a sort of accessible range. We have to build forms of power on the axes that, and bases of power that are accessible to us first. And then maybe if we're successful at winning more and more concessions, maybe that will allow us to sort of fight back on the things that maybe originally got us angry. And that requires focusing on what levers we have, right? What levers we can actually use to then keep building more power. And that's, I think, the hardest thing to do in a situation like the present, the contemporary situation, where it seems like everything is on fire. And I mean, everything is on fire. But we're not going to get anywhere unless we do this, unless we make use of the power that we actually can have to force concessions and gradually build on the concessions that we win to build to gain more and more concessions. So I think I wrote this book obviously in the shadow of the first Trump presidency. I finished it in the Biden presidency. So my focus, it came out last year before the second Trump election, not to mention the Trump presidency. So obviously, I think a lot of things have changed, but my commitment to this sort of idea hasn't really changed as the most important thing for us to invest our time in, most of us, right? There's obviously other things that are also important, but what really needs our energy in defending democracy, whether it's against capture by oligarchic elites or cronies or by authoritarians, is this sort of organizing for power, building countervailing power. So with that, I think I will just let Jim ask me some questions, and then open it up to everybody else. Oh, I was going to say these are some of the sources of collective power that I think are possible that actually threaten the material interest of elites. But I won't say anything about them. I'll just kind of leave them up there for a minute, and maybe we can talk about them. I think Rabia, I think you're muted.
Unmute. Thank you very much. That was very impressive, having to compress your book into about 10 minutes of a very succinct summary. Appreciate it. Jim, you've got questions for Sam? Can we put you back?
Yeah, am I on?
Yes, you are on.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. And first, let me just say it's a pleasure to be here. And as I told Sam when we were doing our warm up before we went live, it's just a pleasure to encounter a political scientist who's talking seriously about power, because over the years I've been disappointed by the extent to which it's not discussed in political science, nor, of course, is it discussed much in the world of economics, my own field, where the only kind of power you find discussed is purchasing power, but you don't find these political dimensions of power discussed. And I thought what you showed in your slides, Sam, about power behind the scenes as well as in the visible range of the spectrum, as you put it, was a very good and really profound way of drawing attention to the range of dimensions of power which extend beyond what is sometimes called decision power, operating in that visible spectrum, to include agenda power, what sometimes is called value power, the ability to shape people's values so they will decide as you yourself would decide, and another form which is sometimes called event power, which comes up particularly in the environmental arena, where I've done a lot of work, where you have the power to impose conditions on people, like put up a polluting facility in their neighborhood without it ever being on any decision-making agenda, really, that people can in any way influence. So I think all of that is really good and important. And I just want to maybe try to ask you to flesh out a few pieces of this broad story. And I guess one way to start off would be to say, if you think of kind of two parameters or two variables that underlie the distribution of power. And if you think of democracy as I think you do, and I do, as a situation where power is reasonably, equitably distributed in society, such that organized elites aren't running the show and pursuing their own self-interest at the expense of everyone else's interest, at the expense of the public interest, then it seems to me there are kind of two sets of variables that are really critical for understanding how power is distributed. One is the underlying distribution of wealth, which you've, of course, referred to and is really important. And the second is the ways in which wealth is mapped into power. And although wealth and power are, of course, correlated, they're not perfectly correlated. If they were, we would be in even deeper shit than we are now, because there'd be no way to really, no points of leverage, as you put it, where we can try to change things, alter the course of history. You would just see this accumulation of advantages and disadvantages on both ends of the spectrum that would just run on and on, it would seem. So there are ways in which the distribution of political power can diverge from the distribution of wealth or of purchasing power, and exploiting those ways and loosening the correlation in a way is, it seems to me, one way of thinking a lot about what your book is trying to address. And so I think, let me ask you if you would agree with me, and I think you do. And so assuming you do, I want to ask you why you think it happened. That over the last decades, going back before the first Trump administration, encompassing the period of the Biden administration too. I mean, obviously it wasn't a perfect continuity with the Trump years before and after, but over this sweep of time going back, you know, at least to the 90s, maybe before that. What we have seen is in both of those parameters or variables, both of those issues, the distribution of wealth, which you depicted on a graph, showing it getting more and more concentrated over these years, and the tightness of the mapping from wealth to power, the extent to which that inegalitarian distribution of wealth translated into oligarchic rule. Both of those deteriorated from the standpoint of having a democratic society. And I wonder if you agree that that's what's happened, what your analysis is of why it happened. What was it that led to that that kind of accumulation of wealth in such a narrow stratum of the society, and along with it, if anything, um, an increase in their power to translate that wealth into the manipulation of the political space, including the state, but also ideology, the media, the whole range of things behind the scenes, as well as the visible part of the state spectrum, that allowed them to consolidate a degree of oligarchic rule, which I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it certainly is unprecedented in my lifetime, in the post World War II period. Why did that happen? Because understanding why it happened, I think, is going to be important for understanding not only what we can do about it today, but how we can prevent this happening again. So I guess that's the first question I'd like to ask you.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot there, and I'll try to touch on all of it. I guess the first thing I will say is that, yeah, there are these two ways of thinking about the problem. One is that there's an underlying inequality in the distribution of wealth, and then there's the way that wealth is translated into political power. And so I just want to say before I get into the sort of meatier part of your question that there's a lot of democratic theory, liberal democratic theory especially, and I consider myself a liberal in a broad sense. But there are some blind spots with a lot of liberal democratic theory, and I think one of them is that they rely too much on the idea that we can prevent inequalities in one sphere from impacting other spheres, right? It says, okay, well, we can have inequalities of wealth, but that's okay because we have political democracy and we're not going to let the wealth, and if the problem, and if we're seeing problems with wealth inequalities or income inequalities leaking into politics, that's not a problem with the wealth or the income inequality per se. That's a problem with the leakiness of our institutions that are allowing that leakage. And so the solutions tend to be focused on preventing leakage, right? And I think that, I'm all for institutions that can prevent leakage, but I think it's a fantasy to try to rely only on those. And that's why, people will say, okay, well, distribution of income, that's an issue of justice, and maybe it's unjust that some people make more money than others and so on, but it's not really a democratic issue, because the democratic issue is once you have the wealth, how does that translate to politics? And I think, no, they're both democratic issues, right? Both the way that we translate political power into politics, and the way that we and how much power wealth people have to begin with, right? So I think you agree, but I just wanted to highlight that because that was kind of in your sort of embedded in the question. So in terms of the substantive question about why have both of these things gotten worse over the last, I would say probably 50 years, maybe 40. There's so many answers, and there's so many correct answers. It's really hard to disaggregate all of them. But I'll say a few things about the things that I think are most important. So one is as actually, I think, to set our baseline a little bit differently. You said, is it maybe it's not unprecedented, but it's unprecedented in your lifetime. And I think that's a really important qualification, because your lifetime is precisely the great anomaly of world history, right? It actually is more of a baseline that a very small number of oligarchic rulers dominate everyone else. And that's true throughout the history of, obviously, pre-modern societies, pre-capitalist societies. It's true of early capitalist societies, including, to the extent that they had democratic institutions. Basically, when that stopped being the case, was because of the enormous destruction, or not entirely because, perhaps, but it was associated with the enormous destruction of the world wars and the Depression, and then the responses to that, but also just literally the destruction of so much European capital that in the wars, right? And that enabled then this period that came after it, where there was relatively lower inequality. But what we've seen in some ways is just a reversion to the mean, and a reversion to the sort of normal mode of human existence, which is a depressing thought, but hopefully it's sobering in a way that it highlights the scale of the challenge that we're facing. Right? We're not in a sense trying to get back to this normal baseline. We're trying to claw back an extremely fragile achievement that we managed to get with the help of a massive destruction that was obviously terrible in its own right, but enabled a certain kind of relative equality for a time. So I think that's the first thing I'll say, is to kind of set our baseline in that way instead. And then the other thing I'll say is that, obviously, if one of the enabling conditions of this sort of anomalous mid-century situation was the destruction of so much capital and unifying nations around enemies, so that they could so that there was some kind of national feeling whereby elites felt like they had to give certain resources to the rest of their population. That was another part of this whole wartime phenomenon. We don't want to recreate those conditions. But one of the things that enabled those transfers of power to stick, at least for some time, is that unions got more powerful. I think that's the single most important difference. And that was more true in the European societies that were relatively more equal always. And inequality has shot up in those places as unions have gotten weaker. And of course, it was never quite as true in the United States that unions were powerful. But when they were relatively more powerful, there was relatively less inequality. And that's the sort of most important illustration in my mind of what countervailing power means, because it represents an enormous force that actually can force concessions from elites, and therefore has a seat at the bargaining table in all of these innumerable contexts, before and after politics, behind the scenes, right? The money behind politics. It's not just money, right? If there are other things other forms of power that unions can bring to bear that get them a seat at that table and force people to listen to them, then then everything else is kind of downstream from that. So there's hundreds, thousands of policies that you could talk about. People call it neoliberalism when they're trying to talk about all of them at once, and there's some good reason to think that there's some logical sense to that, in different ways of talking about neoliberalism. But I think at the core of that is the fact that the balance of social forces in society was greater then, and as the balance started to shift, you got more and more of these sort of quote unquote neoliberal policies were implemented, and then they further accelerated the both of these tracks that you're talking about, right? The concentration of wealth and the ability of people to translate wealth into power, into political power.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with most of what you had to say there, particularly the point you made at the beginning about the um, the illusion that one can address the problem simply by focusing on the mapping from wealth into power, the leakage, as you put it, from the wealth distribution into the power distribution. Um, Without squarely addressing the concentration of wealth as well. I agree with you totally. And I think this is what Justice Louis Brandeis had in mind in that famous quote, which I can't remember exactly, but I'm sure you and many in the audience will know it, something along the lines that, well, you can have highly concentrated wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And he said that early on. I think he said that in the run-up to the Depression, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he was right. And I think that's something we really need to take seriously. And I think it comes through in your writing to some extent. In certain ways, I'd like it to see come through even more, which is why I'm going to push you on this. I think you're right that my lifetime, the post-war period, has been in many ways an anomalous period. They called that early period the 50s, the 60s, kind of. They look back on it as a kind of golden age of a more egalitarian form of capitalism. And I think it's good and useful to put that in the longer perspective and realize that elite capture is not the exception, but historically probably the norm. However, I wouldn't necessarily pin it all on World War II that that led to the break. I think one can go back a little bit earlier. If you think about the New Deal and the Depression, those predated the war. And I think those were also part of setting the stage for the really substantial changes that happened and were already happening in the 30s, even before the war began. They gave us many of the institutions which eased at least some of the sharp edges of inequality and oligarchic rule and held it at bay for a while. So then the war maybe pushed that on a bit further and maybe pushed it a bit broader in terms of its international coverage. But I think that was underway. And so economic crisis, apart from the political crises of war, can be one of the things that helps to bring about a turning point. And maybe that's not quite as grim a prospect at this stage in history than quite as grim as war itself. Looking back on what then happened when this historical moment came and we had achieved a relatively egalitarian distribution of income and power. In the Eisenhower years, as some will recall, the top marginal tax rate was over, I think, 90%. It's hard to imagine Republicans supporting, or even Democrats supporting such a thing now, but that's what it was then. And that was, I think, reflective of a general feeling that extreme concentration of economic power was somehow incompatible with the public good, with public welfare, and with a functioning democracy, really. And yet, despite that, somehow I think, looking back on it all, we failed as a polity, as a society, to come up with mechanisms that would effectively prevent a reconcentration of wealth. Somehow we were too weak to do that. And I think you're right, the weakening of labor, of unions, was an important part of that story, right? And then you get into why did that happen and the ways that globalization weakened the labor movement and so on. I think all of those are parts of the story. But one of the lessons I then take from that is that thinking forward, thinking into what comes next, what comes after the current authoritarian moment, assuming it won't last forever and nothing does. It seems to me, if and when we get another time when we can try to tip the balance of power back towards a more democratic and egalitarian direction, it seems one of the lessons to take from that is that we need to think seriously about how we can achieve a systemic and durable redistribution of wealth in the society. And in your book, you mention at one point you mentioned three elements of a kind of effort to restore enrich democracy, and they're anti-monopoly, countervailing power, and systemic redistribution. And in your talk and in the book as well, I think it's fair to say, you really focus in on the countervailing organized power side of things, which is fair enough. I think, for the short and medium run, that's exactly right to emphasize that. Anti-monopoly, you don't say as much about, and I think we have a pretty good idea of what that would or could look like, even though it's been systematically weakened over the years. We did have an anti-monopoly system. What we never really had, apart from income redistribution, we didn't have anything that systematically attacked the distribution of wealth. And that's something that as I recall, you don't say a lot about in the book. And I wondered if you might be able to say a little bit about it now. If one can imagine a political dispensation where it's possible to raise this issue. And it might be that we don't have to wait for that dispensation. Part of the way to get there is precisely to start talking about, thinking about it now. What would it be? What in your mind would it take to put in place some guardrails on the distribution of wealth that would help to guard against the this trend towards weakening of democracy and strengthening of oligarchic elite rule?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways you could think about a question like this, but I think maybe it's actually useful to start with the kind of most abstract or utopian version of the question, which is to say, what would we want our utopia to look like? How would we design a society from, sort of not completely from scratch, but, given the sort of basic political, technological, economic foundations of a society that's, relatively like our own, in a world governed by states and so on, the relative level of technology we have. How would a society like that ideally be organized? And, for many people who focus and, rightly, are very concerned about the power of, the enormous power of wealthy elites, the answer is that we have to make economic decisions together, democratically, right? This is the core motivation behind any form of socialism, or I shouldn't say any form. There are certain sort of there are certain forms of socialism or things that are called socialism sometimes that are that don't do this. But that is for many kind of socialists, that is the answer, right? We make decisions about politics collectively. That's what democracy means, but they don't really matter because we can't make the decisions about economics collectively, right? And that, in order to therefore have a fully democratic, a fully equal, egalitarian society, we have to be able to make decisions about economics collectively. And that is, as much as I agree with so much of the critique that goes into that, I'm not compelled by that solution precisely because I don't think that there is such a thing as collective decision making in a real way, right? There are lots of different institutions that help us protect the state from being captured by any particular person, but the idea of collective decision-making over economic resources is it's just going to open up avenues for the same sort of agenda manipulation before and behind, before and after, behind the scenes. It's not going to solve this underlying distribution of power. So what sort of my utopia, instead of this kind of utopia of collective decision-making about economics, is a utopia of constant redistribution of private power, right? So people possess private power, private wealth, but concentrations of private power and wealth are not allowed to get very large at all. And basically, there's a kind of continuous wealth transfer system that you can set. There's you can think about how to set the sort of minimum and maximum in different ways, but you would really want to take most of the wealth away from people who have a lot of it, and just sort of redistribute in a way that, in a kind of universal way, that is not going to privilege any particular person or interest or anything. It's not going to give too much power, discretionary power, to the state that could then become captured itself, right? Because the point is to flatten this underlying distribution of power between groups. And the best way to do that is just to have a kind of universal policy that taxes wealth at a pretty high rate to prevent this concentration, and then to redistribute it in sort of unconditional, universal ways to everyone else. That's the kind of, even though it is obviously an enormous exertion of state power to do that, it's not a lot of discretionary power. And so it's not creating state institutions that are going to be very easy to be captured by particular interests, right, for their own. So that's the kind of long-term utopian idea that I think could really stabilize democracy by stabilizing the egalitarian distribution of power. And I think it's important to think about why that's, about why it's attractive and why it's important for democracy, and also why it's different from the kind of typical ideal that radicals often have when they think about this kind of long-term vision, which is collective control. So if we give up that ideal of collective control for the reasons I've suggested, this, I think, is the best way to think about what would support a democratic order. So I don't think I answered everything that you mentioned, but feel free to jump back in there.
Yeah, well, I probably pretty soon we should. You tell me if I'm right, Robbie. We should think about opening things up for audience.
Yes, one last question from you. One last question. Keep it short.
Yeah, well, let me make short. I can't do that, but let me make one comment and then end with one question. The comment is this: that I think you're right that wealth taxation and redistribution is an important area for thinking about. I'm a little bit. I don't know if that's the complete story. Because any kind of tax policy is can be changed, depending on the disposition of power. Just like we saw income tax rates become much less progressive since the Eisenhower era, and so. One of the things I've thought about some, and it's out there on the fringes, but I just want to throw it out there, is that in addition to the alternatives, the actually existing alternatives we have in our society of either privately owned wealth or state-owned wealth, which is kind of the state socialism approach to dealing with it. Let the state own it all in the name of the people, and then everything will be hunky-dory. Well, of course, it didn't work out that way in actually existing socialism in the 20th century, because you had, again, a concentration of power, this time in the hands of the state functionaries, as opposed to the private sector, but it then morphs back into the private sector in Russia, China, and so on, right? So I don't think concentrating the wealth in the hands of the state is a durable solution at all. And that's part of why I think the redistribution through wealth taxation back to individuals has something more attractive about it. But I wonder if it's possible to think about something more than that, in addition to that, which is the creation of what I and a few other people have called another form of property, an alternative to alongside private and state property, which is universal property, property that is owned by everyone in equal and common measure, that is inalienable, that can't be bought, sold, transferred to others, and that is individual. It's shared by individuals. And an example of that would be what happens in Alaska with the oil revenues under the Alaska Permanent Fund, where money from the extraction of natural resources in the states gets put into a fund that pays out annual dividends to every person, adults and children equally, and it's permanent because there's an investment fund. So even after the oil runs out, there'll be money there. And the idea is they've created in a kind of embryonic form, a type of property which acts as something of a floor and a bulwark against the extreme concentration of wealth. I mean, obviously, it doesn't go all the way there, but I think it's an idea that could be expanded upon. And natural resources, gifts of nature, or what religious folk would call gifts of creation, seem to be a natural way to start in terms of thinking about the categories of wealth to which this universal property idea could be applied, but it could go beyond that to socially constructed wealth too, like the financial system that enables, the whole capitalist system to keep rolling over. That's a social construction. There could be financial transaction taxes, which would help to stabilize finance, but would also generate a source of income that could be construed as universal property, as wealth belonging to all, and provide individual dividends. So it's kind of a libertarian form of socialism, if you will. I wanted to throw that out as a final idea. And I guess the last thing, to give you the last word before we open it up to Q&A, is to say, if people ask you, and I imagine some will, what do we do now? Given where things are at now in the United States in particular, let's bring it back home. The United States in 2025, we've got, barely a year before the midterm elections. What should people be doing now to try to turn this ship around?
Yeah. So I'll try to be brief in these kind of two big questions here. I think so that is, I think what you're describing as universal property, I hadn't heard that term before, but I think that is the idea I'm pushing at in the part of the book where I do talk about this a little bit. And I'll say in earlier versions, I had a whole chapter that was actually more discussing this and actually talked about the Alaska Fund and other funds and used the language of unconditional basic income, which is sometimes associated with this, because it's kind of that. It's the other half of the wealth taxation is that where is it going to go? Well, it's going to go to this unconditional, sort of wealth grants. And those, the idea that it would become entrenched more so than other kinds of tax and spend programs is people would come to regard it as an entitlement or as a kind of universal property. It would become a kind of property, at least socially, if not sort of legally or constitutionally, although, it couldn't hurt to institutionalize it in that way. Because of the expectation, because of the simplicity, it's like, okay, everybody gets this amount or this percentage of the total pie, at least that goes into this, again, it makes a whole lot of sense to start with natural resources that don't obviously belong to anybody. But then if you think about how wealth is actually all wealth is in some sense socially created, socially constructed, then really all of it should be subject to that sort of logic. So that is kind of the intuition behind what I'm talking about. And I think, the question of how to make it feel like and seem like and behave like property is an important one. But that's kind of that's kind of what I was going for there. In terms of what to do now, if only there were a good answer to this question. I think we're often tempted, I would say, by the urgency of a particular moment to focus on what seems like we just have to get through this election, or we just have to get these people elected. It's good that people are focusing on those questions, but I think we often do those things at the expense of, and in some cases to the detriment of, the longer term investments that are going to be required to actually defeat the problem long term, or at least even mitigate it substantially. If you think about, think about how much money, how many, I think it's billions at this point of dollars, are spent every election cycle in every swing state. And if you live in one of these states, and you watch television, or even or live in the world, right, you see the same things over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And the return on investment there is incredibly low, right? If you put those billions of dollars instead into building durable organizations that actually reached out to people on a face-to-face basis, you could really scale those organizations a lot. You could pay a lot of organizers to go into communities. And yes, in the moment, it's going to look less efficient than, oh, I can just blast an advertisement and it will reach all these people. But that does nothing in the long term. And if we could redirect even, a tenth, a quarter of those resources to long-term organization building, I think the long-term return on that investment would be orders of magnitude higher in terms of pushing back authoritarianism. So what do we need to do? I think we're off, it's tempting to get caught up in well, what am I doing? Well, what you can do depends a lot on your structural position. And often I think the best thing you can do is, join your union, organize among your coworkers, right? If you have some money, you can figure out where to donate it the best. But, find organizations that are actually reaching out beyond the activist core and are using and trying to develop that are trying to develop larger and larger bases of organization, rather than just going to protests or activating that base over and over, or just fundraising for something that is going to go to this, to these kinds of ad buys or whatever, wherever the vast majority of money goes in these sort of critical, urgent moments, right? They are urgent, but if we address them in the way that we always seem to address these quote unquote urgent problems, we're going to keep having these urgent problems. And so I think some redirection of those resources is perhaps one of the most important priorities that we can have in the moment. And I think, basically, I think the Democrats are going to come back into office. The future of democracy hangs on what they do. And I'm not very confident in their ability, as currently constituted, to do what needs to be done to ensure a democratic future. Obviously, I think the Republicans are the biggest. They're the main, most obvious aggressors, right? But but the Democratic Party has a responsibility to defend democracy in a much savvier and longer term thinking and a much more stalwart way than I think they're doing, and that I think they're prepared to do. That doesn't apply to all Democrats, and I think there's no other way to go about this than to reform the Democratic Party. But that is it is an enormous project of reform. So that's my first answer. I'm sure other people will have other questions and objections to that. So I would love to to hear what people think.
Thank you, Jim, Sam. People, you have questions. I know Barney's got a series of comments and questions in chat, and I see William Elliott Bulmer has some. So, Barney, if you just unmute yourselves, please. I don't know if you can also turn your video on. I seem to be not able to do it at my end, so that we can see.
I can't turn the video on, but I can unmute myself.
All right. Okay. Unmute yourself. Do you want to? Do you want to ask a question, Barney?
Yeah. I'll try to put this as simply as I can.
Yeah.
I see why you call it a realist theory, because you're saying that political change takes place through the exercise of power, not by the equivalent would be international law and norms, no, by the exercise of power. But and countervailing power cannot be created by convincing people rationally what is in their interests. That is the problem. You need, it is cultural. It needs narrative. It needs preaching. Just what we are seeing now, as I wrote in the chat, is an unprecedented consolidation of ownership of the means of producing knowledge, information, and narratives. And that it's sort of like Gramsci's idea of counter hegemony, but doing it, talking about it is one thing. Doing it requires, an artistic or poetic genius, which I guess we don't have one in the room today. But I wonder if you deal with that cultural aspect of hegemony in your book.
Yeah, so I think I like to think about it. So I absolutely agree that it's not realist to, explain to people what their interests are in sort of rational terms, and that's going to do the job. And I have a paper, actually a separate paper about that. Interesting, you brought up preaching, right? It's called Preaching to the Choir, and it's about this precise issue of how do you mobilize people's on the basis of their identities and the things that actually move them to change their minds, which is not rational persuasion, right? Like how do you change people's identities? How do you mobilize people's identities? Because that's really what's driving people's behavior, political behavior. And I think preaching is a kind of interesting example of this, and an allegory for the kind of political rhetoric that can be successful at this. That said, I think rhetoric, even the focus on sort of political rhetoric and culture, is to miss, I think, the most important point, because I actually think that for a long time, we're seeing this change now, but for a long time, there was a kind of the liberals and to some extent progressives had a lot of cultural ideological power. I mean, when the people on the right talk about this and complain about the cultural, intellectual, academic elites, like obviously there's a lot wrong with what they're saying and what they're trying to do, but there's a core of truth there about who actually is in charge of a lot of the cultural institutions. So I think just thinking about it in terms of cultural or narratives is missing a little bit of the point. And what needs to be accompanied by, yes, we need the great poets and the great rhetoricians and the great preachers who are going to move people in that way, but we also need the organizational structure. And that for me is where it's not, getting people to join a union is in part about going to them and explaining what their interests are, but mostly it's about face-to-face, day-to-day contact, and then getting them to feel the problem in a deeper way, and to then become, to become the kind of person, to become a different kind of person, essentially. That's really hard. You can do it sometimes with preaching and rhetoric. That's really, really effective, but most often it's going to require actually getting them to take part in actions and to do things as part of an organization. And that's what gets people to change their heart and their identity. And that's, they can't change their minds before they change their identities, their hearts in that sense. So yeah, I mean, the chapter 10 of the book, the last chapter, is kind of about that. It's about both the sort of institutions for building power and the institutions for changing identity, because I think those things are intimately interlinked. But that's also the focus of basically a lot of the stuff that I'm doing now, because I think the answer that I provide in chapter 10 is very limited, and I think it's the most important question, and one that I want to keep learning from history and social science more and more about, because I think it's the question that we have to answer.
Thank you. Ron, did you have anything else?
Well, just say, if you look, just 2 points. First of all, apparently Donald Trump thinks that late night comedians play an important role in politics. So we have to take that into account. It was sort of what you were saying just now. The other thing is who is a little bit successful in leftish politics today. It's not people who talk about the Republicans are taking away your health care, like Chuck Schumer and Jeffrey. It's people like Bernie Sanders and AOC on the oligarchy tour who have a story about what's going wrong and who get out there and really preach about it. Now, that doesn't build a majority, but it gets people out, or Zoran Mamdani for that matter. You know, I mean, of course, he's all about buses and grocery stores, but I think he's also a masterful raconteur, if you see his films and so on.
Well, if Zohran Mamdani should win the mayoral election, one would think that would be some small evidence of countervailing power having succeeded in preventing elite capture or pushing back against elite capture in the New York City, given the powers that are arrayed against him.
Well, there'll be a lot more power arrayed against him then, but let's see what happens.
Yeah. Did you have a comment, Sam, or shall we go to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to share that view, but I also recognize that there's it's tricky. Politics is tricky, and you know, there's I think one of the things that's holding Democrats back is a commitment to certain truths of politics that may have been true in the 90s or something, but may have never even been true, and certainly are not true anymore, which is the idea that, you know, voters who are sort of swing voters, or that they're sort of ideologically moderate. And that's just not true. I mean, political scientists know that this is not true. Swing voters and voters that call themselves moderate are not actually moderate in the sort of way that the way that sort of educated elites think about being moderate, which that most of their positions are somewhere in the center, right? Swing voters are voters that are sort of that sometimes will call themselves moderate. They have a wide range of positions, or sometimes not very many coherent, stable positions at all. And so the idea that, oh, somebody who's further to the left is going to necessarily like alienate more people, and therefore is going to get less vote share in the election. It's just based on a completely false understanding of voter behavior. Now, does that mean that leftist candidates are always going to do better? Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case, right? Mamdani's run is encouraging. You know, you had. Before that, New York elected Eric Adams, and you know, not for lack of compelling alternatives in that race, right? So you know, sometimes there's you know, there's different forces at work, and sometimes you have to kind of ride a moment, which I think, yeah, now is a moment for forces like Zoran Mamdani, but I don't think it's sort of just axiomatic that a kind of, and I'm not saying that you were saying that either, but I'm sometimes tempted to think that that's true, that it's axiomatic that sort of more progressive or left-leaning politicians would win more votes. But you know, that's what I would like to believe, and unfortunately I think it's probably not always true.
William Wilmer, are you there still? Would you like to ask a question, please? I see that you've got a bunch of comments.
It will not let me turn my video on, unfortunately. But
I know, unfortunately, I messed up the settings, so that's why people can't put their videos on. We can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. So a few sort of points that I'd like to get your reflections on. One is, as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not American. And most of my scholarship has been on sort of Westminster model systems in the British Commonwealth. One of the things that we see is that the leakage between wealth and power varies a lot. And the United States is very atypical in, you know, it's not even a pipe. I mean, it's just a hole where wealth pours and gushes into power. And other countries seem to actually do more to block that. just things like, you talk about buying airtime. Well, in a lot of countries, you can't buy airtime. It's not allowed. So you can have all the money you want to buy airtime, but there's no market for political airtime because it's controlled by the government, and distributed between parties. And so my first sort of point is that, yes, I see that you need to do more than just fix the leakage, but actually, when that leakage is so huge, there may be like really obvious things that could be done to fix it. The second point that I was going to make is the importance of institutions and constitutions in this. And again, the United States is very atypical in its type of constitutional structure, and the ways in which, while it seems to have very few veto points as we see at the moment in the way of actual tyranny, it has lots of veto points in the way of things that are sort of pro-public policies. And so I would like to see, if we're going to look at the utopian element of this, I would like to see some thought about how can constitutions be changed to make them more resistant to wealth and its political effects, but also just more effective at actually delivering policies that are orientated towards the common good. And that might include things like, why don't we have legislative chambers in which trade unions are represented, or from which anybody with a net worth of more than 1 million is necessarily excluded, or various institutional mechanisms that are designed to structurally rebalance how different economic classes access the state. And my closing point here, just to illustrate that, is when I first started studying politics, I remember I had a textbook, and on the front of the textbook were 3 images, and it was the British Conservative Party conference, the Labour Party conference, and the Trade Union Congress. And at the point when that book was written, which was probably late 1980s, the Trade Union Congress was still seen as the third power in the land. And I wonder whether, in the same way, and I've been hugely influenced here by sort of John McCormick and the sort of neo-Roman scholars, but whether in the same way as tribunes of the plebs and sort of forms of non-elite representation were incorporated into the Roman Republic, I wonder whether we could do more at a constitutional level. And I'm not necessarily talking about the immediate future of the United States here, although the Second American Republic, after all of this settles out, could be very interesting. But if we're talking kind of in utopian terms and what we'd like to see, is there room for kind of the constitutional engineering to fix at least some of this?
Yeah, so basically I want to, especially with your first point, I want to kind of agree and say, I think there are some lower hanging fruit in terms of, especially in the United States, about stopping leakage, right? So I'm not against stopping leakage. I think we should stop the leakage where we can, and there are many sort of low hanging fruit that could definitely help. I think the problem is when we think that is going to solve the whole problem, and I think the dominance of American oligarchs is much more in your face than in Europe. But Europe, where they have a lot of these sort of low hanging fruit, have been implemented, like they're still pretty serious, I would say, oligarchic capture of so many of the institutions. And that's because when you have that much concentrated wealth, you find other ways to deploy it. Now, you might not get quite as much return on your investment as you would in a context where there's where there's more leakage, but you're still going to find other ways. And in fact, some of the institutions that we implement to try to stop the leakage can have unintended effects that maybe don't cancel out the whole benefit, but certainly mitigate any benefits that we thought we were getting from them, right? So one of my favorite examples is like, if you have public financing of elections, that stops the sort of most direct influence of campaign finance on elected officials. But then you get often a situation where parties that are in power form a kind of cartel, and they control the sort of rules by which public financing is doled out to elections, to parties. And so they then what their incentives are to kind of stop other parties from getting access to those resources. And so they they form a cartel, and they hoard those resources to themselves. And part of doing that is kind of agreeing not to compete too hard with one another, especially about certain issues, right? And so that's when you get, okay, what issues are they not going to compete about? Well, the ones that threaten oligarchic interests, right? So there's some great scholarship on this about the cartel parties in Europe, where in these situations it's enabled by public financing of elections. So I think often there are these unintended consequences of things that seem like really good ideas, which is not to say that we shouldn't try them. I think it's probably still better on the whole to have some degree of public financing and limits and so on. But I think in an important way, it's also missing the point, missing the underlying point, and to focus our attention on that as opposed to the underlying distribution is to make a mistake of some kind. That's the sort of line I want to hold there. In terms of whether there's room for more ground level constitutional changes, I do have a part in the book where I talk about some of these ideas, and again, it's the case where I'm not really against them, but I think that they're likely to have less positive impact than we would think, and they're likely to be more capturable. And I'm a little bit bothered by the inflexibility, right? So I want to live in a world where the rules for who I want to live in a world where it's not going to be the case that the same sort of class divisions are going to be permanent. And so I want to have a system in which political competition, the axes of political competition, are going to vary over time. And if you constitutionalize a particular axis of competition, say the mass versus the elite, the poor versus the wealthy, if you constitutionalize that, like, I do think that should be the axis of political competition now in current circumstances, but I think you can channel that into party competition. If you constitutionalize it the way that, say, the Romans did, I think it sort of admits that this is going to be permanent in a way that I find unattractive, right? And it then might also, in some, I would love to live in a world where that was no longer the main axis of political, dispute and difference. But if we should reach such a world where it's no longer the main axis of disagreement, those institutions that we've constitutionalized are no longer going to fit the political the political structures that we need. And so I would worry a little bit about constitutionalizing it. But that's just to say it's not my priority. And it's not the thing that I focus on, because I think it has these sort of downsides, and it could backfire. And I think it's not going to solve all of our problems, and especially depending on the way that you organize it, it could be captured. I mean, famously, the tribunate in Rome was was used by Caesar and lots of leaders who ended up taking authoritarian power, right? It's not impossible for those sorts of institutions to be captured in the same sort of way. So that's kind of why I don't that sort of constitutionalization isn't the main pathway that I focus on. But it is certainly a very interesting and productive area of research, and certainly some of those things could beneficially be tried.
Sam, thank you very much. There are a couple of other questions, but I think we're going to have to leave it there because it is late. And I'm very, very grateful for both you and Jim here, and for everyone who's put in all those wonderful the long comments in chat. So there will be a recording available, and the messages will be there too. So the chat will be there too, the Q&As and the comments, and people can access those. I don't know, Sam. I was hoping I'd feel better after this conversation. Feeling still pretty depressed, but okay. It's a long
Whenever I want to
struggle.
feel better, I just think about the very long term. I think
Yeah.
truth has a power that is hard to suppress forever. And yes, I guess the long term also is there's been a lot of, oligarchy in human history, but
Yeah.
there is also a progressive arc, which has to do with we get better at stuff, we discover more of the truth, and that has to have some role to play too. Even though, yeah, I tend to have a pessimistic vibe on a lot of days too. But whenever I want to get out of that rut, I think about the progressive trends that do exist, and the long term. We've come back from much worse, I think.
Yeah, well, maybe in a few years you'll have a revised edition of this book, which will also take into account the current political era we're passing through. Jim, did you have any closing comment?
No, I just want to thank you for organizing this, Rabia, and thank all the audience for having tuned in.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. They've hung in there. I'm very impressed. What are some
Someone
good
asked what are some good organizations to contribute to. I would say I think somebody doing the work in terms of pulling the Democratic Party to where it needs to be, which I think is perhaps the most important task in this moment, is the Working Families Party. I think they have a lot of good orientation. You can donate money, you can contribute also time, get involved. There's various levels of involvement. So if I had to pick one, I think that would be the one.
Very good. So I will thank you once again, and I will thank everyone for joining us. We will be doing this again in November, and we will have Umar Al-Akkad, who is the author of One Day Everyone Will Have Been Against This, in conversation with the literary editor of the Literary Hub. So I hope that you will join us for that, and you will hear from me. But meanwhile, thank you ever so much, Sam, Jim, and everybody else who joined us. And have a restful evening. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.